The year I started graduate school, the documentary Spellbound was released. The film follows 3 boys and 5 girls as they prepare for and compete in the finals of the Scripps National Spelling Bee. To get to the finals, an adrenaline-filled 3-day affair staged annually in Washington, D.C., and broadcast live on ESPN, which normally focuses its programming on high-stakes sports matchups, these kids must first outspell thousands of other students from hundreds of schools across the country. This means spelling increasingly obscure words without a single error, in round after round, first besting all the other students in the contestants' classroom, then in their grade, school, district, and region. Spellbound got me wondering, to what extent is flawlessly spelling words like schottisch and symmetricus a matter of precocious verbal talent, and to what extent is grit at play? I called the Bee's executive director, a dynamic woman and former champion speller herself named Paige Kimball. Kimball was as curious as I was to learn more about the psychological makeup of winners. She agreed to send out questionnaires to all 273 spellers just as soon as they qualified for the finals, which would take place several months later. In return for the princely reward of a $25 gift card, about 2/3 of the spellers returned the questionnaires to my lab. The oldest respondent was 15 years old, the absolute age limit according to competition rules, and the youngest was just 7. In addition to completing the grit scale, spellers reported how much time they devoted to spelling practice. On average, they practiced more than an hour a day on weekdays and more than 2 hours a day on weekends. But there was a lot of variation around those averages. Some spellers were hardly studying at all, and some were studying as much as 9 hours on a given Saturday. Separately, I contacted a subsample of spellers and administered a verbal intelligence test. As a group, the spellers demonstrated unusual verbal ability, but there was a fairly wide range of scores, with some kids scoring at the verbal prodigy level and others average for their age. When ESPN aired the final rounds of the competition, I watched all the way through to the concluding suspenseful moments, when at last 13-year-old Anurag Kashyap correctly spelled appoggiatura, a musical term for a kind of grace note, to win the championship. Then, with the final rankings in hand, I analyzed my data. Here's what I found. Measurements of grit taken months before the final competition predicted how well spellers would eventually perform. Put simply, grittier kids went further in competition. How did they do it? By studying many more hours, and also by competing in more spelling bees. What about talent? Verbal intelligence also predicted getting further in competition, but there was no relationship at all between verbal IQ and grit. What's more, verbally talented spellers did not study any more than less able spellers, nor did they have a longer track record of competition. The separation of grit and talent emerged again in a separate study I ran on Ivy League undergraduates. There, SAT scores and grit were, in fact, inversely correlated. Students in that select sample who had higher SAT scores were on average just slightly less gritty than their peers. Putting together this finding with the other data I'd collected, I came to a fundamental insight that would guide my future work. Our potential is one thing. What we do with it is quite another.